Good evening, everyone. We are excited to have you join us here tonight at the Tocqueville Lecture Series, and we are excited to have Dr. Philip Yaure join us here too. Before we get going, I'd like to just share a little bit about the lecture series with you and a little introduction here about our presenter tonight. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is named after Alexis de Tocqueville. Born of the French aristocracy, Tocqueville examined the world to understand democracy. His investigations convinced him that the liberal ideas, which rejected the antiquity of aristocracy and doubted the promises of the French Revolution, were the progression of history. Whether individuals fought for or against these ideals, he was convinced that equality of conditions is a providential fact. This lecture series invites scholars, professionals, and civic leaders to present on the ideas of liberty and equality as they relate to other concepts important in the founding and continuation of American government. Hosted on the campus of Jacksonville State University, these free lectures are open to the public. We welcome the campus, community, and country to come together to listen, think, reflect, and engage. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is funded by generous grants from the Jack Miller Center and the Alabama Humanities Alliance. The Jack Miller Center is dedicated to advancing education in America's history, its political and economic institutions, and the central principles, ideas, and issues arising from the American and Western traditions, which continue to animate our national life. The Alabama Humanities Alliance exists to provide context, build empathy, and make the state of Alabama a more vibrant place to live, all through the humanities. It's my pleasure tonight to have Dr. Philip Yaure join us. He is an assistant professor of philosophy at Virginia Tech University, where he specializes in social and political philosophy and the history of African American political thought. His work has appeared in Ethics, American Political Thought, Philosophic Studies, New Political Science, and the Civil War Book Review. He is particularly interested in questions concerning the nature of political community and citizenship, and he explores the ways in which Black American political thinkers theorize these concepts in the antebellum period. Tonight's talk draws on material from his first book project, which argues that Frederick Douglass makes a distinctive intervention in the history of Republican political thought by fundamentally reimagining the nature of American citizenship. It's my pleasure to hand the microphone and the screen over to Dr. Philip Yaure.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Dr. Gross. And thank you all for coming out this evening. As I was mentioning to Ben just before our session started, I'm in the midst of finalizing the first draft of the manuscript, the book manuscript that I'll be presenting today. And so it's been nice to take a little step back and think about the big picture, as opposed to just doing all the copy editing, fixing all the commas right now. And my family and friends are also quite grateful to you all that someone else finally is going to listen to me talk about all this material and they get a little bit of respite. So thank you for that. So before I screen share with my PowerPoint, I'm going to put a version of the PowerPoint into the chat. The reason I'm doing this is that most of the documents that I've linked to, or I'm going to discuss during the talk, I've linked to on the PowerPoint. You won't actually be able to click on the PowerPoint when I screen share, but if there's any of these materials you want to look at in more detail, you can download the PowerPoint and click on any of the hyperlinks there. You won't need to do that for the presentation, but just in case you're interested. All right, so get started. Okay. So let's begin by taking ourselves all the way back to July 1853 in Rochester, New York. In the sweltering upstate heat, we would have found delegates from Black communities all across the United States gather in response to a call issued by more than 36 Black American national leaders and abolitionists. This call stated that for free colored people from all parts of the United States to meet together to confer, deliberate upon the present condition, and upon principles and measures important to their welfare, progress, and general improvement. Now, this meeting in Rochester was part of a long social movement marked by over 200 national and state conventions held from 1830 to 1899, in which Black Americans met all across the US to organize resistance to slavery and white supremacy, and to define and advance their collective interests. For anyone that's interested in the history of this movement, I strongly recommend the scholarship that has been produced by the Colored Conventions Project, in particular their edited volume, The Colored Conventions Movement, which is linked to here, as well as their repository of digitized documents, which you can find at coloredconventions.org. Now, if we found ourselves in the audience of this convention in Rochester on its first day, on July 6th, 1853, we would have been lucky enough to witness the former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass deliver a speech titled Address of the Colored National Convention to the People of the United States. Addressing the people of the United States as fellow citizens, Douglass insists that members of the convention will address the nation not as aliens nor as exiles, but as American citizens asserting their rights on their own native soil. At the core of the demands that Douglass issues in this address is the declaration that we, that is Black Americans, are of right and ought to be American citizens. Notice the way in which Douglass formulates this demand. He doesn't call on the nation to confer citizenship on Black Americans, to give them the status of citizens. Rather, Douglass calls on the nation to recognize that Black Americans in the 1850s already are citizens of the nation. So this declaration that Black Americans are already American citizens whom the nation ought to recognize as such. This is a refrain in Douglass's speeches and writings all throughout the 1850s and the decade leading up to the Civil War. So for instance, in a speech that Douglass gives at the Liberty Party National Convention in 1851, the speech entitled The Free Negro's Place is in America, Douglass reminds the nation that we, again speaking for Black Americans, leveled your forests. Our hands removed the stumps from your fields and raised the first crops and brought the first produce to your tables. We have been with you, we are still with you, have been with you in adversity, and by the help of God, will be with you in prosperity. We have fought for this country, we are American citizens. Moreover, Douglass doesn't restrict this claim to free Black Americans. He also insists that enslaved Black Americans are citizens too. In a trenchant critique of the Dred Scott decision, that is the 1857 Supreme Court case that found that no person of African descent could claim American citizenship. This is also the infamous case in which Chief Justice Taney infamously stated that Black Americans had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. So in his trenchant critique of that Supreme Court decision, Douglass defiantly declares that the Constitution knows all human inhabitants of this country as part of the people. Again, what I want to emphasize about these declarations is that Douglass is not saying that Black Americans, enslaved or free, should be American citizens. He's saying that Black Americans, enslaved and free, already are American citizens. So the question that I want to explore with you today, the main question that I take up in my book project, is what can Douglass possibly mean by the term citizen in this context, such that a people exploited by centuries of slavery, codified and legalized forms of violence, and even explicit legal decisions stating that they're not citizens, like Dred Scott. How can Douglass say that Black Americans nevertheless count as American citizens? Now, as I hope is obvious, Douglass's point is not that Black Americans are citizens and therefore everything is just and okay and nothing needs to change in the 1850s in the US. Rather, Douglass's point is that the forms of oppression and exploitation that Black Americans in the 1850s are subjected to wrong them as American citizens. The demands on the nation that Black Americans issue through, for instance, the 1853 convention in Rochester, which Douglass speaks, these are demands Black Americans make not only as members of the human race, but also as members of the American people. This is to say that these demands are not just impersonal demands for the nation to do the right thing. They're personalized demands of the form, you all owe this to us. So as I've said, the question we're going to think about today is, what does Douglass mean by the term citizen when he says that Black Americans in the 1850s are already American citizens? My thesis is that Douglass is drawing on an idea of citizenship found in the Republican tradition of political philosophy. For Republicans, this is some relationship to the American political party, the Republican Party, but it wouldn't be identical with the contemporary party today. So for Republicans, this philosophical tradition, citizenship is an activity. It is something that we do rather than a status that is given to us by others. In particular, Republicans say that what it is to be a citizen is to act in ways that contribute to one's political community, what I'll sometimes call a polity. By a polity, I just mean a political community like a nation or a state. Douglass takes up this idea that being a citizen means contributing to the polity, and he develops it in surprising ways in order to articulate what I think is a radically inclusive idea of what it means to be a member of a political community. In particular, as we'll see, Douglass argues that Black Americans contribute to the nation through their resistance against slavery and white supremacy. Douglass's idea of American citizenship highlights the power of people who are marginalized and exploited to seize for themselves the rights and recognition of citizenship through collective resistance against oppression. Achieving emancipation, getting free, is not, on Douglass's account, a matter of persuading the privileged and the powerful to share their power. Emancipatory politics for Douglass is about organizing and acting to take power for ourselves. Now, I imagine that many people in the audience know of Frederick Douglass, but let me give a few biographical remarks as background for my argument. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in 1818 in Eastern Maryland. He was raised for the first years of his life by his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, until he was forced to work on the plantation of the Alds. In a daring and meticulously organized effort in 1838, Douglass escaped to New York and eventually to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he reunites with his wife, Anna, who was born free and played an integral role in his escape. In Massachusetts, Douglass gets involved with the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison in the late 1830s and throughout the 1840s. With Garrison, he gives many anti-slavery lectures in which he recounts his own life and experiences as an enslaved person. And he gives these lectures all across the Northeast and what is today the Midwest. But by the late 1840s and early 1850s, the period that we're especially going to be focused in tonight, Douglass breaks with Garrison over the question of anti-slavery strategy. Whereas Garrison thinks that the only effective means for combating slavery is moral suasion, that is, giving moral and religious reasons to persuade people that slavery is wrong, Douglass comes to think that a viable anti-slavery movement needs to make direct use of American political institutions and values. After the Civil War, Douglass takes on a variety of governmental roles, including serving as the president of the Freedmen Savings Bank, as an assistant secretary on a commission to the Dominican Republic, as a nominee for vice president on the Equal Rights Party ticket, and as consul general to Haiti in the early 1890s. He dies suddenly from a heart attack in 1895 at the age of 77. So we're going to be focused, like I said, on this period of Douglass's thought in the 1850s, when in this moment in his career, he's broken with William Lloyd Garrison over differences concerning the best strategy for fighting slavery in the US. In the early 1850s, after he breaks with Garrison, Douglass adopts a strategy that historians today call political abolitionism. Political abolitionists thought that it was necessary and effective to use America's political institutions and values, in other words, the coercive power of the state, to combat slavery and white supremacy. Now, you might think that that's a fairly sensible and intuitive position for anyone to adopt. Who would disagree with that type of strategy? Well, there's two other perspectives or other anti-slavery strategies that are prevalent in the 1850s: moral suasion and separatism. Moral suasionists like William Lloyd Garrison sought to combat slavery and white supremacy through argument. They appealed to moral and religious commitments to persuade white Americans that slavery was wrong. Moral suasionists like Garrison refused to make use of tactics that involved power and coercion. They tried to keep their hands clean of politics. They were committed to nonviolence on principle and believed that the power of the American state could only be used to reinforce slavery, not to undermine it. Separatists, on the other hand, sought to create sovereign political communities for Black people in the US that were beyond the reach of the American state. These strategies in the 1850s typically involved calling for Black Americans to emigrate beyond the borders of the US to join or found a polity elsewhere. One variety of separatist projects that we find in the 1850s are Black nationalist projects, such as the emigrationism of Martin Delany. Delany was a Black abolitionist who worked with Douglass at various points before the Civil War, but who came in the 1850s to advocate for Black Americans to leave the US and to emigrate. At times, Delany argued to Africa, at other times to South America. We also find in this period white-led colonizationist projects, in particular under the banner of the American Colonization Society. The American Colonization Society, for instance, organized initiatives for Black Americans to emigrate to Liberia. These immigrants suffered a disturbingly high death rate, at times upwards of 40%. So Douglass, in contrast to the moral suasionists like Garrison and separatists like Delany, Douglass thought that the anti-slavery struggle had to be fought on the terrain of American politics. Abolitionists, Douglass thought, had to claim the nation's values as anti-slavery and enlist the nation's institutions to dismantle the slave system. Douglass's position that enslaved and free Black Americans were already in the 1850s American citizens was a key plank of his political abolitionism. It was important for Douglass to cast the many forms of resistance that Black Americans already engaged in against slavery and white supremacy as ways in which they were participating in American politics. This is because he wanted to cast political abolitionism not as a project that white abolitionists and politicians in the North would undertake on behalf of Black Americans, but rather as a project in which Black Americans were themselves direct and central participants. So my key claim is that when Douglass says that Black Americans, enslaved and free, are already American citizens, he means that they're members of the Republic because they contribute to it. He's thinking about citizenship in terms of contributing to the nation. Now, I was trained as an analytic philosopher, so I'd be remiss if I didn't inflict one definition on you all with a bunch of semi-formal logical notation. Sorry, I promise I will do this just once tonight. But here's what that definition underlined on the slide says in ordinary English. A given person is a member of a polity if and only if she contributes to that polity by shaping its civic ethos. In other words, what it is to be a citizen, on Douglass's view, is to act in ways that help determine what the polity values. We contribute to the nation as citizens by shaping its basic values or its civic ethos. In thinking of citizenship in these terms, Douglass embeds himself in the tradition of Republican political thought, on which the citizen is someone who participates in the political life or the public life of the polity. Now, what I think is really distinctive about Douglass's conception of Republican citizenship, the way that he's thinking about Republican citizenship, is that he gives us a deeply capacious, a deeply inclusive understanding of what counts as contributing to the polity by participating in its public life. As we'll see, for Douglass, both grand and quotidian forms of resistance against slavery, both the big stuff and the everyday stuff, these are forms of social interaction which shape a community's normative foundation. They shape what the community values. And that's really the core contribution for Douglass. When we're interacting with one another, including through grand and everyday forms of resistance, we're shaping what our community values. Douglass's conception of Republican citizenship is radically inclusive and pluralistic. That means that many different kinds of activity count as contributions to the polity. But his idea of citizenship is also demanding. We have to do something in order to become citizens. Nobody gives it to us. It doesn't come for free. Now, since this is the Tocqueville lecture series, I did want to note a connection between how Douglass thinks about American citizenship and Tocqueville's account of American political life. In Democracy in America, Tocqueville observes that one important distinctive feature of American political life is the prevalence of political and civic associations into which Americans organize themselves. Tocqueville describes the formation of these associations as a means by which Americans actively participate in their collective articulation of their common good, what is good for them as a community. So in particular, Tocqueville writes that as soon as several inhabitants of the United States have conceived a sentiment or an idea that they would want to produce in the world, they seek each other out. And when they have found each other, they unite. From then on, they are no longer isolated men, but a power one sees from afar, whose actions serve as an example, a power that speaks and to which one listens. Douglass takes up Tocqueville's picture of American political life, on which citizens organize themselves into associations with the collective power to articulate and advance visions of what the polity should value, as the basis of his claim of American citizenship for Black Americans. In other words, Douglass is thinking about the everyday forms of resistance against slavery and white supremacy that Black Americans engage in the 1850s as an example of the type of civic associations that Tocqueville is describing in Democracy in America. So there, I think, is one interesting theoretical connection between Tocqueville and Douglass. For both of them, what it is to be an American citizen is in large part to form associations with one another. So we articulate what we value and try to enlist others or to enact that vision as something that the nation supports or values. So Aristotle, among many famous things that he said, one of the famous things that he said is that the word being is said in many ways. We mean many different things by the word being. The same point applies to the word citizenship. We use the word citizen to refer to a number of different ideas. In general, citizenship is a status that people possess. It's something that you have. We make claims on a particular political community because we possess the status of citizenship. So for anyone that's seen the film Babel, the American couple, Kate Blanchett and Brad Pitt, I never remember the characters' names, but they make calls on the American embassy to evacuate Blanchett's character after she's shot in an accident while they're in vacation. They call in the American embassy because they're American citizens, and they take themselves to have a claim on the American state to help them in virtue of this fact. But there are many different ways of explaining why someone is a citizen or why they're justified in making these claims on a particular state, a particular nation. So often we say that someone is a citizen because the state or the nation gave her that status, say through a process of naturalization. We also sometimes think of citizenship as something that's conferred in terms of a set of rights being given to you. This comes up, for instance, when we say that someone who's denied her right to vote is in some sense denied her citizenship. Many people also think that one is a citizen perhaps because she shares in a national identity or ethos or culture, or because of birthright, that is, because she was born in the country. Republicans, in contrast to all of these other views, they say that what makes you a citizen is your political participation, the fact that you participate in the public life of your polity. So, for instance, Aristotle in the Politics states that the citizen is one who shares or participates in the administration of justice and in the holding of political office. Rousseau in The Social Contract describes the citizen as one who shares in the sovereign power of the polity, helps to shape its general will. And the contemporary philosopher Joseph Cairns characterizes citizens as people who live and work and raise their families in a society. The important point here is that for all three of these thinkers, and for Republicans generally, it's not that one has a right to participate in, as Aristotle puts it, the administration of justice because one is a citizen. Rather, one is a citizen because she does these things, because she participates in the administration of justice, because she participates in the political life of the polity. So on the Republican conception of citizenship, we are citizens of a polity because we participate in its political or its public life. Participation is valuable, Republicans think, because what we're doing when we participate in the polity's public life is we're contributing to the polity. That's what public service is. So as two political theorists, Kimlicka and Norman, put it in their classic article on citizenship, in the Republican tradition, political participation is defined as activity that's desirable to the polity. In other words, when we're engaged in the polity's public life, when we're engaged in public service, we're doing things that contribute to the community's common good or its public good. So what's distinctive about the Republican conception of citizenship is that it is a status that derives from the activity of persons. In other words, it's what we do that makes us citizens. Citizenship in this Republican sense, it's not a status that the state gives us. Rather, it's in the power of each of us to seize citizenship for ourselves by finding ways to participate in our polity's public life. Now, the traditional conception of Republican citizenship, it has a bad rap among at least some political philosophers and theorists, and maybe for a good reason. Traditional formulations of Republican citizenship severely restrict what kinds of activity count as participating in the public life of the polity, and thereby who is actually in a position to make themselves citizens. Traditionally, Republicans hold that activities like holding political office, serving in the military, participating in deliberation on law and policy, these are the kinds of things that count as roles through which persons contribute to the polity and thereby make themselves citizens. So that's to say that Republicans traditionally conceive of the public sphere, public life, very narrowly, with very limited avenues for participation. Now, political philosophers and theorists have long recognized that this traditional formulation of Republican citizenship tends towards exclusion. Only a small number of people in any given nation are going to be able to be citizens in this very demanding sense. So Benjamin Constant, in his essay, his classic essay on the liberty of the ancients and the liberty of the moderns, points out that modern polities, modern political communities, they're just too big. Not everyone's able to hold political office in a country the size of France for Constant or the United States, for instance. Not everyone's going to be able to participate in public life in that way. But contemporary critics, political theorists over the last 30 years or so, have pushed these criticisms of republicanism even further. So some have argued that freedom is built into the very idea of political participation for Republicans, in the sense that one already has to be free or independent from others in order to be able to contribute as a citizen. The forms of political participation that Republicans traditionally require, they focus on things like material security, so that we're able to take care of one's well-being and to help sustain the polity. They also focus on things like education, that a citizen should be in a position to make the proper sorts of judgments about what the polity should do, and they need the education, the background to do that. And Republicans will say that citizens need civic virtue. They need to have the kind of virtue so that they're disposed to sacrifice their own individual interests for the benefits of the community as a whole. And the point of these Republican critics is that many people in a society are going to lack access to these forms of material security or education, or perhaps even civic virtue. Other contemporary theorists have observed that the labor of some must be exploited in order for others to participate in the political sphere narrowly construed. So here's an example of this. Let's go back to ancient Athens. We can think of the propertied male citizens who go to the assembly and they deliberate for hours on everything the polity is going to do. Well, that's what makes them citizens for the Republican, because they show up to the assembly and they deliberate. But why are they able to do that? Well, it's because there's lots of other people in the community, women and slaves, who are doing all the social reproductive labor. So these critics will point out that what puts some in the position to participate in the public life of the polity is the exploitation of the labor of others that's devalued, that isn't recognized as contributing to the polity's common good. So, okay, so in light of all of these criticisms, that it seems like Republican citizenship is fairly exclusionary, only a small number of people in any given nation are going to count as citizens in this specific sense, it might seem kind of surprising that Douglass draws on the Republican concept of citizenship to serve as the foundation of its political abolitionism. That is, to serve as the basis of his claim that Black Americans are already American citizens. The Republican idea of citizenship has, for centuries, justified the exclusion and marginalization of subordinated peoples. Yet, Douglass is able to see some inclusive, some emancipatory potential in this Republican concept of citizenship, because he rejects the traditional narrow understanding of what counts as a contribution to the polity. To see this, let's go back to a passage that we looked at earlier from Douglass's 1851 address at the Liberty Party National Convention. So in this passage, Douglass is clearly arguing that Black Americans are citizens because of their contributions to the nation. So as he writes on the slide, I believe that simultaneously with the landing of the Pilgrims, there landed slaves on the shore of this continent, and that for 230 years and more, we have had a foothold on this continent. We have grown up with you. We have watered your soil with our tears. We have nourished it with our blood, tilled it with our hands. As I read before, as a reminder, we leveled your forests, our hands removed the stumps from your fields, and raised the first crops and brought the first produce to your tables. We have been with you and are still with you, have been with you in adversity, and by the help of God, will be with you in prosperity. We have fought for this country. We are American citizens. One implication of this passage is that Douglass thinks that people can act in ways that contribute to the polity and thereby make them citizens, even if they're not already free. What Douglass is pointing out in this passage is that enslaved Black Americans have contributed to the US in all of these ways that count as making them into citizens, he thinks, in this Republican sense. In other passages where Douglass asserts that enslaved and free Black Americans are American citizens, he claims that the resistance against slavery and white supremacy in particular, that these are ways in which they contribute to the nation as citizens. So, for example, in the 1853 speech that Douglass is giving in very sweaty and hot Rochester in New York, right, the claims of our common cause, the speech, Douglass states that resistance against tyranny is obedience to God, and that Black Americans are citizens by the principles of the Declaration of Independence. What Douglass is asserting here is that Black Americans constitute themselves as citizens by resisting slavery and white supremacy, because in so doing, they enact values encoded into the Declaration of Independence, this commitment to resist tyranny. By enacting these values, Douglass says, through resistance, they participate in the public life of the polity. They do the thing that makes you a Republican citizen. Thus, Douglass formulates a position in the context of Republican political philosophy that I call abolitionist republicanism. For Douglass, the free citizen is forged through struggle against tyranny and oppression. It's not that one needs to be free in order to be a citizen, but rather one struggle to be free is itself a way of contributing to the polity that makes you a citizen. Becoming free and becoming a citizen for Douglass are things that happen at once and together. So at this point, hopefully it's clear that Douglass thinks that resisting slavery and white supremacy, this is a way of contributing to the nation and thereby making oneself a citizen in the Republican sense. The next question that we need to take up is, why is such a way of resisting, or why is such resistance a way of contributing to the nation? So there are, I think, two broad ways of trying to answer this question. What I've called on the slide, the narrow strategy and the wide strategy. I guess this is another philosopher's habit. Sometimes we'll just label things as the more narrow thing and the more wide thing. So bear with me. Let me explain what I mean by each of those. So the answer, according to the narrow strategy, is that the American polity, it already values resistance against tyranny and oppression. It's already written into the Declaration of Independence. Part of what it is to be an American is to resist such tyranny and oppression. Now, this seems to be Douglass's view in his famous 1852 speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, as well as in his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. In these places, Douglass likens the resistance of enslaved Black Americans to that of American revolutionaries at the time of the Declaration of Independence. On the narrow strategy, resistance against slavery counts as a contribution to the polity because it enacts principles that the polity already values, this commitment to resist tyranny and oppression. Now, I think that's plausible as an interpretation of Douglass so far as it goes, but one major limitation of the narrow strategy is that it's contingent. It's not guaranteed that a given polity, in fact, values this commitment to resist tyranny and oppression. Some polities in the world will value this commitment and others will not. Indeed, it would be pretty reasonable for someone to doubt, if they're living in the US in the 1850s, to doubt that America could be said to value this commitment to resist tyranny and oppression. To think this, it seems like Douglass would have to be committed to a particular form of American exceptionalism. He'd have to think that the US was a polity that was special in the sense that it really did happen to value resistance against tyranny and oppression. Now, maybe that's right or wrong, but it seems like all that we could say on some level is, phew, thank goodness that we ended up in a nation with the right values. Thank God. So I used to find this narrow strategy appealing as an interpretation of Douglass. But over the course of working on this book, I've come to a different interpretation, which doesn't require that we read Douglass as an American exceptionalist. It doesn't require that we think, phew, we found ourselves in a nation with the right values. Rather, on the wide strategy, the interpretation that I now hold, resistance against slavery, it counts as a contribution to the polity because it's a type of activity that contests and shapes what the polity values. So in this wide interpretation, we don't have to ascribe any fixed pre-existing set of values to the nation. Rather, the citizen's not someone who enacts what the polity already values. Rather, the citizen is someone who fights for her vision of what the polity should value and tries to bring others to endorse her vision. So the key to seeing how Douglass adopts the wide strategy lies in his remarks on the nature of constitutional interpretation. In particular, in the closing moments of this most famous speech that he gives in 1852, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. So here, Douglass characterizes constitutional interpretation as a paradigmatic, a really central way of contributing to the polity as a citizen. Here he writes, I hold that every American citizen has a right to form an opinion of the Constitution and to propagate that opinion, and to use all honorable means to make his opinion the prevailing one. What Douglass means when he says that citizens have a right to form an opinion of the Constitution is that it's in the power of ordinary people to formulate such an opinion. And what he's doing is he's suggesting that when you do this, when you formulate an opinion of the nation's Constitution, you make yourself into a citizen. You're acting like a citizen. Crucially for Douglass, constitutional interpretation here, it's in the power of all of us as ordinary citizens. He's not thinking about constitutional interpretation as an activity that a specialized set of experts engage in after they go to law school. So he states that constitutional interpretation involves plain common sense rules, such as you and I and all of us can understand and apply without having passed years of law and study. What Douglass means by constitutional interpretation, then, is activity through which we articulate a vision of what the polity should value. When we do this, we're contesting or trying to shape the polity's civic ethos, its basic values. So I shape what our community values by articulating my vision of what it should value. I give you arguments, or I try to otherwise persuade you to share in my vision of what we should value. And it's when I do this that I act as a citizen in Douglass's Republican sense. So Douglass applies his account of constitutional interpretation as an activity through which we shape the polity's values. He applies this to the situation of Black Americans by holding that resisting slavery is a way of interpreting the nation's constitution. Again, in this more general sense of trying to articulate what the nation should value. So for Douglass, what this means is that anti-slavery resistance contests and shapes the nation's civic ethos or its fundamental values. Anti-slavery resistance has this power to shape the nation's civic ethos in two ways, Douglass thinks. First, because it's a type of, or it involves collaboration between enslaved people engaged in such resistance. And second, it has this power to shape the nation's civic ethos because it involves a kind of contestation or a confrontation with tyrants and oppressors. So what I'll do to conclude this talk is to spell out exactly how these two dimensions of anti-slavery resistance function as modes of constitutional interpretation that shape America's civic ethos and thereby constitute enslaved and free Black Americans in the 1850s as American citizens. So resistance against slavery was often a collective endeavor. Douglass illustrates this point in his autobiography. In particular, I focus on his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. He writes 3 over the course of his life. In the second autobiography, Douglass describes his experience of a Sabbath school that he helped to organize, in which slaves covertly taught one another how to read scripture. Key participants in the Sabbath school, including Douglass, go on to make an attempt at escaping from slavery. The pivotal episode in Douglass's account of the Sabbath school, at least for our purposes, is this moment in which Douglass describes the deep forms of commitment that are forged among its participants. He writes, "I never loved, esteemed, or confided in men more than I did these. They were true as steel, and no band of brothers could have been more loving. We never undertook to do anything of any importance which was likely to affect each other without mutual consultation. We were generally a unit and moved together. Thoughts and sentiments were exchanged between us, which might very well be called incendiary by oppressors and tyrants." Douglass here is describing the ways in which sustained collective action generates commitments among those who are acting together. Some of these commitments are what we might call open-ended mutual obligations, things like trust, loyalty, solidarity. If we're loyal to one another, well, there might be very different, they might call on us to do very different things in very different circumstances. What it means to be loyal to your friends depends on the situations that you find yourselves in. Other values that we realize by collaborating together in resistance are things like this commitment to resist tyranny and oppression. It's something that we share in common. What collaboration does in Douglass's accounts in all of these different ways is articulate a vision of how members of a wider community should relate to one another. The group that's resisting provides a model for other people to subscribe to. So it gives you a picture of what people in a community owe to one another and what values they should share. So whereas the collaborative dimension of anti-slavery resistance articulates a positive vision of how members of a polity should relate and what they should value, confrontation challenges values that members of a polity already hold. Anti-slavery resistance, Douglass shows, confronts the injustice and exploitation of the slave system. Grand forms of resistance like rebellion do this. But I think it's important that Douglass also has in mind more quotidian or localized or everyday forms of confrontation. For instance, in his autobiography, Douglass describes acts that he calls appeals, in which enslaved persons contest their maltreatment, for instance, by appealing to a slaveholder about the violent acts of an overseer. About these kind of tactics, Douglass writes, when a slave has nerve enough to protest or appeal and boldly approaches his master with a well-founded complaint against an overseer, though he may be repulsed and may even have that of which he complains repeated at the time, and though he may be beaten by his master as well as the overseer for his termity, in the end, the policy of complaining is generally vindicated by the relaxed rigor of the overseer's treatment. The latter becomes more careful and is less disposed to use the lash upon slaves thereafter. And here's the really important part. It is with this final result in view, rather than with any expectation of immediate good, that the outraged slave is induced to meet his master with a complaint. Acts of resistance for Douglass, ways in which enslaved people manifest their moral standing to their oppressors. The primary thing that's going on in the appeal Douglass thinks is not this calculation that if I engage in this appeal, it'll be more likely tomorrow that I will be better off. Rather, it's a way of manifesting one's moral worth, the fact that one matters. So here then is the idea of citizenship that Douglass invokes when he asserts throughout the 1850s that enslaved Black Americans are already American citizens. To be a citizen, Douglass says, is to contribute to the polity. One contributes to the polity by acting in ways that shape what it values. Crucially, what makes me a citizen on Douglass's account is not that my normative vision wins out. That is, that I've already succeeded in imposing my vision of what the polity should value on others. That's not what's going on in the case of the appeal that we just looked at. Rather, what makes me a citizen is the fact that I participate in this collective and dynamic process of deciding what we value as a community by manifesting, enacting, confronting others with my own vision of what we should value. It's the manifesting it, not the uptake, that matters for Douglass. So political participation, including anti-slavery resistance, shapes what the polity values in these two ways. So first, through collaboration, in which shared commitments and values are forged that will represent a positive vision of what the community should value. And on the other hand, through confrontation, through which one manifests and asserts one's moral worth and dignity in the face of its denial. Douglass's account reflects what I think is the intuitive point, that political activity typically is both collaborative and adversarial at the same time. We're working together with some and fighting against others. Douglass doesn't privilege collaboration or confrontation as the true or ideal form of political participation. They're both integral elements of how we engage in political life, how we act as citizens. We're collaborating and confronting others all the time. So then, to spell out in closing what I think is the theoretical appeal or the emancipatory potential of Douglass's conception of citizenship, I think we can start by noting a seemingly unintuitive result of his account. So Douglass thinks that any sustained effort to shape what the polity values counts as a contribution. Well, that seems to imply that anyone who espouses, let's say, an oppressive or exclusionary vision of the nation is a citizen in virtue of espousing this oppressive or exclusionary idea of the nation's values. Douglass's idea of contribution, as I said, is really capacious. It's really inclusive. It counts lots of different types of activity. This seems to mean that the acts of oppressors also constitute themselves as citizens of the polity. So to put the point a little provocatively, it can frame it in two ways depending on your political perspective. Either Douglass might say that, yes, the actions of those involved in the insurrection on January 6th count as a way of comporting themselves as Republican citizens. Or conversely, we could make the same point about Black Lives Matter protesters in 2020. These are confrontational ways of manifesting and acting one's citizenship, Douglass thinks. But importantly, This doesn't imply that Douglass's conception of Republican citizenship is entirely neutral here. Douglass thinks that any sustained effort to try to shape what the polity values counts as a type of contribution that makes me a citizen. So one person's exclusionary vision of a polity and her efforts to enact that vision can't annul, they can't take away the contributions of someone else who she seeks to exclude. Because it's not her values that are determining what the polity values, it's the fact that we're both acting to try to shape what the community values. Someone else, Douglass thinks, can't undermine or take away my status as a citizen, no matter what values they're espousing. So Douglass's conception of Republican citizenship, it thus provides what we might think, and this is something we'd expect that he'd want in the 1850s, a normative upper hand to those engaged in emancipatory efforts that try to make a political community more inclusive. While at the same time, Douglass does admit a profound variety of activities that count as ways of participating in the polity's public life. There's no one right way of doing it. In essence, Douglass's abolitionist republicanism attunes us to the social and the insurgent character of political agency. That is, the power that each of us possesses to forge political community with those around us. Thank you very much.
Outstanding. Dr. Yaure, we really appreciate that's I think a great presentation and a really thoughtful presentation. And we've had a great audience here that's sent in some Q&As. And so I hope you'd be willing to take a few of those, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Let me also, it looks like my laptop came unplugged. So let me fix it or I disappear from you guys. Yes, I'm happy to take the questions. Please.
Fantastic. I said, and if you want to submit a question, please feel free to still submit them, or you can use the raise hand feature there in your navigation bar. And I'm happy to unmute and bring you in to let you ask your own question. One of our questions came in and it asked about, from earlier in the presentation, about the Black separatist movement. And it asked, did the Black-led separatists favor President Monroe's push into Liberia? Did this common ideology make both groups allies?
That's a great historical question. So I think that so one thing to acknowledge is that there's going to be a variety of different separatists, Black separatists, who are going to endorse a different political strategy. So there's not going to be one straightforward answer here. I will say that particularly in the case of Martin Delany, he sometimes explores relationships with, for instance, the American Colonization Society. But the thing that's really important for Delany, the sense in which he's a Republican, is he thinks that sovereignty or the capacity to self-govern is really important. So Delany is deeply wary throughout most of his political career, at least in the pre-Civil War period, of working closely with the US government or with white-led organizations like the American Colonization Society, precisely because he thinks that working with these communities or these organizations undermines the ability of Black Americans to secure their own sovereignty. So it's sort of, for many Black separatists like Delany, what's really at stake here is whether these kinds of projects or the way in which we can undertake them, is this going to put Black Americans in a better position to govern themselves? One other thing I'll add here, like one way which we can think about the dispute between Douglass and Delany is that Douglass thinks that there's ways in which Black Americans can organize themselves within the United States that count as a type of self-governance. So Douglass is interested in Black Americans building solidarity with one another as they're resisting slavery and white supremacy. And he thinks this is possible to do, even in the 1850s in the US. Delany doesn't think that's possible. So that's why they end up breaking. Even though they're quite close in the late 1840s, Delany ends up thinking it's not possible for us to self-govern ourselves as Black Americans in the US, so we have to leave. Douglass thinks that it's possible to do so in some sense. So he continues to advocate for this type of political abolitionism. But that's a really great historical question.
Wonderful, wonderful. One of our undergraduates here at Jacksonville State asked if Douglass would have seen the civil rights movement at the time of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, do you think he would have put more support behind one of the movements than the other movement?
It's an interesting question to try to speculate about what Douglass would have thought in these cases. You know, I've been thinking a lot about this with the kind of interpretive work that I'm doing in my own book project. So like there's this question of Douglass isn't alive now. Douglass can't update his views, but Douglass was a rich political thinker whose positions on lots of things changed over the course of his career. So one thing that's kind of challenging, I think, is to think about, well, like Douglass at what moment of his thought? I don't think there's going to be one straightforward answer here. I mean, I think that probably Douglass's position here would be to think about the productive types of interaction between different strategies for resisting white supremacy and racism in the US in the 50s and 60s, for instance. That he thinks that there is something to be gained by both engaging in struggles that focus more primarily on shaping civil rights or reshaping the law, and also focused on efforts that are much more emphasizing a kind of self-organization for Black Americans. What's maybe distinctive about Douglass in contrast to King or Malcolm X is they think that these two things are complementary to one another. So I think that for Douglass, the ways in which he's thinking about Black Americans is organizing themselves into a self-governing entity, a people that's part of the American people, I think is the way that he thinks about it. The reason that's valuable is he thinks it's precisely a way of generating more collective political agency for Black Americans to try to shape American values, including through the law. So like this goes back to the Tocqueville point that like what it is to be an American is to try to build these associations with other people. Like that's what we do as part of our political life. And Douglass will say it's precisely by building these kinds of associations. And he thinks Black Americans can do that in many, many, many different ways. But it's precisely by building those kinds of associations in the way that Malcolm X is thinking of, that Black Americans are in a position to do the kind of work that King is advocating for, reshaping the American civic ethos, including law.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think that's really thoughtful because I think that is a tough question, right? It's that counter, like, you can't know the history. And so I think that's a really thoughtful answer. Well, let's think about this, especially as you said, the own evolution of Douglass's thought throughout his life. I'm going to hand the mic over here. We have a hand up from Sylvie, so I'm going to hand the mic over to let the question come in.
Hi, my name is Sylvie Bello, and I am a community member. I am an African immigrant activist, and my question is going to be around immigration and Douglass. But I just want to say that as African immigrants, within immigration, there is a lot of anti-Africanism that stems directly from slavery and the banning of Africans' free migration during the forced and involuntary migration. About your topic on citizenship as contributions or contributions to citizenship, is that a concept that undocumented African migrants, undocumented immigrants can tap into? Do you think Douglass would put similarities? Because for us, we've been talking about that as undocumented African immigrants. Again, that's where I work, that we contribute by paying taxes. So if they're undocumented Africans who can now vote, they're still contributing in the US when they pay taxes. But I don't know if Douglass's contribution to citizenship would be applicable. Thank you.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Yes, in fact, this gets to, I think I gestured to this kind of thought very briefly when I was talking about how other Republicans think about citizenship. But yes, this is actually one motivation for why I think the way that Douglass thinks about Republican citizenship is interesting for us today. So the passage that I mentioned very briefly in passing is from this contemporary political philosopher, Joseph Cairns, who thinks a lot about the political theory and philosophy of immigration. And Karen says that like what it is to be a citizen, at least in this Republican sense, is to be a person who lives and works and raises their families in a society. And then there's other scholars that work closely with Karen. So Sarah Song is another political theorist who thinks about these kind of ideas that like what it is to contribute to a community is precisely all of the things that we do. Sure, paying taxes, but also even more ordinary forms of everyday interaction with the people around us. And I think that part of what's really appealing about the way that Douglass thinks about contribution and citizenship, he's emphasizing the ways in which everyday forms of interaction with one another, these are ways of contributing to our community. And the way that Douglass argues for this is he says, all the time when we're interacting with each other, when we're, say, acknowledging each other down the street, when I'm helping you out in a moment of crisis, whatever it may be, I'm articulating an idea of like what it is that we should value, that we should prioritize one another's well-being, that we should make one another feel welcome, for instance. And Douglas says it's not, I mean, those things are good in themselves, but he'll say that is the kind of activity that makes you a citizen. It's because you're interacting with the people around you. So I do think that there's this really interesting potential in the way that Douglas is thinking about Republican citizenship to say something like, in fact, all of the ordinary ways in which people interact with one another, just because they're bumping up against each other, because they live next to each other. These are the kinds of things that make us citizen. Taxes count, but we can even think of more ordinary forms of interaction. And then, within the history of Republican political thought, this is really surprising because Republicans are like, it's only a really narrow, limited set of people that are citizens. It's really hard to be a citizen. And Douglas actually, I think, while acknowledging that, yeah, citizenship is something that we have to do. We all have to live up to this demand to contribute to our community. Douglas is thinking, and I think in a really rich way, about how all of the different things that can count as contributing to our community in that way. So yes, absolutely. I think there's a really rich connection between the way that Douglas is thinking about Republican citizenship and contemporary questions around immigration.
Sylvie, does that help to answer the question? Do you have any follow-ups?
Thank you. Actually, I do have a follow-up question. When you think about the first question that you had answered about going back to Africa for the enslaved Africans who were thinking about should they go to Canada, Mexico, or go to Liberia, and today, when if you are a naturalized citizen, if you do get into trouble, and with Black migrants, we have the largest or the highest numbers of deportation, just because policing Black bodies affects all Black bodies, and especially when they see that you're an immigrant, they will deport you even if you have citizenship. And I don't know if that ever happened during the early stages during Douglas's time in the 50s, leading up to the Civil War and post-Civil War. Was there a time where people questioned a Black person's citizenship and said, we're going to ship you to Liberia, you should go back, you're not a real citizen, either there then as it is now? I don't know if my question is making sense. I'm so sorry. Thank you.
No, that makes a great deal of sense. I think that the primary way, if you were a Black person in the US in the 1850s in the US and someone is challenging your citizenship, often the thing that is happening is that you're being kidnapped into slavery. This is around especially the Fugitive Slave Acts, especially the one of 1850. And so a lot of what actually Douglas and Delaney both write very directly about this. They instruct other Black activists to be very careful when you're out on the road, because even just showing your papers that prove your citizenship or prove your freedom can be ripped up and torn up by authorities as they're looking at them. So be really careful about that. So I think the primary case of a Black American citizenship being challenged that they're experiencing is going to be this case of being kidnapped into slavery. The other thing that I will mention, though, and I know this is kind of indirect with your question, but one other criticism that Delaney's separatism is subject to is that all of his strategies for emigration, leaving the US, that these are strategies that only it seemed like free Black Americans were in a position to undertake. Delaney's thinking you need to expend a lot of money to buy the ticket on the ship to go to somewhere else and then have the resources to start building up your home and your community, much less considerations of if you're enslaved and you're not free to actually leave the nation in the first place. And so actually one of the ways in which Douglas ends up criticizing Delaney is he says this isn't a strategy that's enlisting or engaging enslaved Black Americans in the South in any kind of systematic way. Douglas polemically, so in this trying to pick a fight way, I'll say, you're giving up on Black Americans in the South, Martin Delaney. And Delaney's takes an affront to that. And, I think that we could think in more detail about whether that criticism is really fair. But I do think that one thing that it's worth emphasizing is that the separatists like Delaney often are speaking primarily to free Black Americans in the North. And I think one important part of Douglas's political abolitionism is that he's trying to envision a way in which both free Black Americans in the North and enslaved Black Americans in the South are able to act together in concert to resist slavery.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to return back to the queue here. But please, of course, raise your hand if you have any more questions. But we have another one in the queue here. Another one of our students asked, are there other similarities between how Douglass and Tocqueville think with regards to citizenship, or just their thinkings in general? Are there any other similarities we could look at between perhaps Tocqueville and Douglass? Which I know it puts you on the spot because this is but I think there's a little interest here in Tocqueville.
Oh, lovely. Yes. And the way that you're putting me on the spots is that the canon of folks that are reading philosophy, I read a lot more Douglass than I read Tocqueville. So you're catching me out on that front. But I mean, one thing that I can say in general, actually, and this connects fairly closely to this point about what it is to be an American citizen is to like associate with others. There's this idea in Tocqueville of like enlightened self-interest. So a lot of what we're doing when we sort of understand what the common good of our community is, what we should all value is, it's in our interest as individuals, but it's on the basis of reflection and deliberation and engagement with one another that we come to recognize just not what our ordinary off the bat self-interest is, not what we want in any given moment, but our enlightened reflective way of thinking about what we value. One thing that I think Douglass would agree with this, and I think that Douglass would emphasize the very diverse, all the different ways in which we can engage in that process of gaining this kind of enlightened self-interest. So I was teaching earlier today, actually the same passage that I mentioned with Douglass talking about the Sabbath school in which enslaved people are teaching one another how to read covertly, right? It's forbidden. And I was teaching this earlier today to a intro to moral and political philosophy course. And the point that I was trying to bring out there was in part that Douglass is thinking about these as what Aristotle would call these friendships of virtue, which were committed to one another's well-being. And I think that part of what Douglass would want to emphasize is the way in which we come to something like enlightened self-interest, where we come to see what we value as something that we share in common with others. It's not just something that we do through abstract forms of argument. It's not just about op-eds or arguments that we make in the Senate or something like this. It's, again, through our ordinary, everyday interactions with one another. And we're teaching one another how to read or caring for one another in moments of illness or, whatever the case may be. So I think that Douglass would both agree that the process of becoming a citizen, you would agree with Tocqueville, is in part a process of coming to understand your self-interest well understood, your enlightened self-interest. But Douglass would say that there's lots of different ways that maybe Tocqueville wouldn't have recognized that we in fact can come to our self-interest well understood.
No, I think, and the joining, I think perhaps the idea of the ethos not being totally unguided, Tocqueville's idea that there is this progression of equality, that the equality of conditions is this element of history that you cannot deny, that even when those that fight against it eventually lose out against. That might be another thing that would be Douglass might recognize in the sense of that ethos having some guide or some it's not totally unguided.
I think I think that way of framing it in terms of the ethos isn't unguided is really helpful, because I do think it's important for Douglass that it's not that it's guaranteed that equality is already either built into the way the nation's eventually going to be organized or something like this. We have to do things to realize the potential that's built into the founding documents like the Declaration and the Constitution, right? We have to do things to make it the case that a nascent idea of equality is realized. But Douglass does, I think it's right to think that there are facts in our history that we're able to appeal to make use of in order to engage in that progressive project of pursuing justice and equality. So I think it's guided is a very nice way of putting it. We still have to do things, but there are reasons I think for Douglass to be, if not optimistic, at least hopeful.
Oh, awesome. We have a question here from another person, professor within the state of Alabama. He asks, would it appear that Douglass's support of violent conflict is by definition opposed to republicanism? So I'll leave that there, but I said he wants to join in. He can raise his hand. I can let him explain more of what that question might mean.
I think part of what's at stake here is another important strand of republicanism, and forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, is that republicanism is often committed to things like stability, the rule of law. So we might think that there's going to be an intrinsic tension between the idea of forms of violent resistance that undermine the rule of law or undermine a state's stability, thinking of them as ways of contributing as a citizen. I do think that Douglass is going to say that many forms of violent resistance can count as a way of comporting oneself as a citizen, as contributing to the polity. And I think this connects to, in a different way, one of the main themes that have been coming out in this Q&A, that a lot of what Douglass is doing is thinking about the rich normative character, all of the expression of value that's built into our interactions with one another. So let me give one concrete example. What is often taken as the climactic episode of Douglass's autobiography is the fight with the slave breaker Covey. So Douglass is forced onto Covey's plantation. Covey's, the slaveholder, was a reputation for breaking the will of and disciplining rebellious slaves. And eventually Douglass and Covey come to blows. Douglass prevents Covey from attacking him, from beating him. Now, Douglass describes a lot of really important values that are expressed in this. He says, I've become a man now. Covey comes to recognize to some degree nascently my human dignity. Importantly, Douglass doesn't say something like, the value of this fight is that I have in fact practically freed myself. He emphasizes that at any moment, Covey could have in fact called law enforcement to arrest me and have me killed. So I think that part of what's really important for Douglass in these episodes of violent resistance, for instance, is the kind of their capacity to express values that other people should be responsive to. And so that's how I think for Douglass it ends up tying into this idea of what it is to be a Republican citizenship, is to articulate a vision of what we value. But I'd be happy to talk about this more.
Am I on?
You are, John. You are.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, the statement or the question I put in there wasn't formulated as well as I would have liked, but I'm thinking about your sense of, or the sense of civic virtue, and that all citizens would participate, sharing values, at least certain, maybe a certain percentage of the values with each other. And it strikes me that you can have different kinds of civic virtues. So revolutionary kinds of activities or attempts to overthrow the government, say on January 6th, which by the way does not seem to be equivalent to Black Lives Matter efforts, but you may disagree with that. But you've got the civics, you've got the society, you've got the form of economic development, which includes slavery. Not the same kind of slavery for Aristotle, strikes me. He would see this very differently, because slavery is a matter of by nature, and the kind of slavery that's being done in the United States at that time was not by nature, it was by race. Maybe understanding the Black race as inferior, as bad as that anthropology is, of course. But if you have a society set up where it is structured, and then some individuals in it want to change it, maybe a good idea from a different point of view, that is different standards of fairness and equality and rights and justice. But to say, as I understood you saying, that Douglass, I mean, I'm thinking of his speech on the July 4th. Actually, I think it was the day before or after, but that seemed to me to be more one of suasion, not of action. Brings in a lot of religious teachings and the like. But to have any group want to undermine and overthrow, or maybe not overthrow exactly, but undermine the economy, the politics, strikes me that's not civic virtue. Maybe a good activity, but it doesn't strike me that that's civic virtue. So yeah, that's what I meant by wondering, how could
I see.
You get the point? Okay,
that's really helpful. Yes, great. So a couple of things. So first, I'll say that I, in my personal political views, share the distinction you want to draw between the insurrection and the protests in 2020. Didn't want to be presumptuous for the audience on that regard. I guess so. Two things. So one I'll say on the Republican side and one on the Douglass side. So I think that when Machiavelli, for instance, so another Renaissance Republican thinker, a lot of what Machiavelli is talking about in the discourse, for instance, around civic virtue is questions about what kinds of conspiracies can citizens engage in ways that can still count as trying to contribute to the polity, ways of counting as trying to save the republic, for instance. And not anything's going to go there for Machiavelli, but I do think that there's some kind of, so you might think that with Machiavelli that like, I can conspire to undermine the current regime or to save the republic, and that can count as a way of being a Republican citizen to the extent that I'm still committed to the survival of the republic. And I'm not sure that Douglass would exactly use the phrase like the survival of the republic, but maybe something like it. He would say something like, to the extent that you're committed to trying to shape what we as a community value, then that's the kind of activity that's going to count as being civic virtue. There's lots of kinds of violent conflict where all we're trying to do is to destroy institutions or kill off other people. That's not going to count as civic virtues for Douglass. So it's not that anything goes. And this will seem maybe like an odd connection, but I think this actually comes out in the way that Douglass describes the thing that happens after the Sabbath school in his autobiography. So Douglass says that the core members of the Sabbath school, this band of brothers, they go on to organize this escape plot. So they attempt to escape to the north, they forge some papers, they acquire a series of boats, they've got this plan, they're going to escape. The night or the morning of it's discovered. And Douglass, he's never quite sure about this, but he thinks that one of the members of the band informed their slaveholder that this plot was afoot and caused it to be discovered and everyone else to be arrested. And Douglass does describe that member of the band as betraying the rest of the band. So I do think that for Douglass, there are going to be some constraints. There are ways that we can act that betray the rest of the community. So that wouldn't count as comporting oneself as a citizen or as a member of the community. In some sense, Douglass is saying that individual who betrayed our band is now no longer a member of the band. But two things. One, I think that for Douglass, it's really important that there's many different kinds of activity that are going to be confrontational or even violent that aren't going to take that form for him, that aren't going to count as a betrayal. They're going to count as a type of confrontation in which we're fighting over what we should value. And I also think it's important for Douglass that like part of what it's involved in betrayal is that you've been comporting yourself as a citizen and now you've done something to undermine it. So that's part of what that Sandy, this particular individual who's part of the band, then betrays it and now no longer is acting as a citizen. So I see where you're coming from now, and I do think that Douglass would want to impose some constraints on what kinds of activity would count as contributing to the nation. I just think that they don't neatly map onto violent conflict as opposed to public deliberation or something like this.
That's what I was wondering. Thank you.
Yes.
Awesome. We have another question here from one of our community members. He asks, did Douglass's concept of Republican citizenship have precursors in European political philosophy?
Yes. So I think that I guess there's two ways of approaching this question. One is the history of ideas way, and the other is the history of philosophy way. So the history of ideas way would be thinking about who is Douglass reading that's influencing him. And I will just confess, I haven't been trained in that way of approaching things. Douglass, his texts are beautiful and wonderful and interesting. They don't have a lot of footnotes. So that's about, in terms of my scholarly ability to identify who exactly is it that Douglass is reading. But part of what I've been trying to do is, and this is the history of philosophy way of thinking about it, is regardless of who Douglass individually is reading, who can we think about him as being in conversation with, in the sense of raising the same kinds of questions and issues. And there I do think that we can go back to Aristotle, Machiavelli, Rousseau, for instance, as these figures who were saying what it is to be a citizen is to participate in the public life of the polity. And it's in particular to try to shape what that polity values. And part of what Douglass is doing is taking up that idea of citizenship and showing just how inclusive it can be, how we can think of so many different types of everyday social interaction as, in fact, doing the thing that Republicans say make you as a citizen. So absolutely, I think that Douglass is thinking about the same sorts of questions that folks like Aristotle or Machiavelli or Rousseau are thinking about. And I'll also add, actually, I'll repost it for anyone that might have joined late. So most of the passages that I referenced throughout the talk are hyperlinked in the PowerPoint. You couldn't have clicked on it when I was screen sharing, but if you want to look at them, you can. So I definitely think he's thinking about the same issues. And I just confess that I haven't been trained in the kind of historical skills that will tell you who exactly Douglass is reading, though. I wish that I knew.
No, I do too. It would be very helpful, right? But I think,
oh, sorry.
You go ahead. No.
Also, part of the issue I can say is that like one of his house catches fire after the Civil War, and he actually loses a lot of his materials, including a lot of his copies of the newspapers that he was in charge of publishing. So we might also imagine that a lot of the books that he kept were in fact destroyed there. So yes, there's a number of historical challenges here. Absolutely.
I mean, I have some questions, but I'm going to, I know our time is precious and we have a couple more students that have questions, so I want to give them a chance here. One of our students asked, what was Douglass's relationship like with President Lincoln, and what kind of influence did he have, if any, on his policies and speeches, perhaps through these ideas of citizenship?
So I think that, or in general, so Douglass has a relationship that grows with Lincoln over time. James Oakes, I do have here, good. So if you want to think about this, one really lovely history that focuses on this is James Oakes, the Radical and the Republican. So he'll tell you, I guess that's backwards. That's okay. Let me type it in the chat for you. Oakes, the Radical, and the Republican. So that'll give you a really concrete history of their interactions. I mean, one thing that I think is significant in terms of Douglass's own transformation and his political thought, which reflects the way in which he gets closer and closer to Lincoln in the pre-Civil War period. And then I know that some of you also heard about Douglass's, one of his final speeches, his oration to Lincoln later on. Part of what Douglass is doing here is that he starts in the 1840s thinking that the US Constitution is pro-slavery. Politics are useless for trying to advance a cause like abolition. There's nothing that we could do but appeal to moral arguments and reasons. And progressively over the course of the 1850s, this political thinker who said, I can't have anything to do with American politics, comes to think, oh, here are all the different ways in which I can think about American politics as a means by which I can try to advance these abolitionist aims. And ultimately comes, by the time of the Civil War, to be meeting with Lincoln. Douglass becomes an active recruiter for Black Army units in the Civil War. So a lot of what I think we see in Douglass's coming closer and closer and coming to interact with Lincoln, part of what we see in that is this shift in his thought from his time in the 1840s when he thinks American politics, there's nothing that we can do with it, to this idea that there's so much that we can do with American political institutions and values. And the key that I'm trying to suggest in this talk is that for Douglass, what's driving that is this recognition that politics is something that we do through all of our associations with one another, through which our everyday interactions we express what we value. And so that's why ultimately he comes to the White House and meets with Lincoln and sees Lincoln as a potential ally. It's this transformation, not in just in his grand idea of politics, but also in his idea of ordinary political interactions between everyday citizens.
And I think for the American context, that brings a lot of interest in federalism too then, right? That there's these actions we take every day in the local government. We may be focusing on DC, these things we do locally in our communities that make us therefore citizens, which Tocqueville again would find a lot of interest in.
Yes.
Yeah. I think we have time here for one more question. So I apologize for those who maybe we didn't get to a question to tonight, but you know what? Hopefully the book might have some answers when it comes out, right? And if not, you know, I think one of the things I do love about the virtual is this just means we have to bring you the campus, Phil. We just eventually have to, you know, get you down here to Alabama, come visit.
I would be delighted.
It would be awesome to have you come visit and see the foothills of Appalachia. You're in proper mountain. We have the foothills down here, the beginning of the AT.
Indeed.
So our last question here, in what ways do you think Douglass was hypocritical in his actions based on his rhetoric? And this question says, I still think of his refusal to aid John Brown in his raid as being a hypocritical action of him. And so do you find, I guess this question, if I could summarize it, it seems to be, are there any hypocrisies within Douglass's thoughts and actions about Republican citizenship?
That's a very interesting question. So for background that folks that might not be aware, so John Brown comes to Douglass very soon before his raid at Harper's Ferry, when he and a group of other Black and white Americans try to seize one of the largest armories. Maybe is this the largest armory in the U.S. in order to, in an effort to try to spark a slave revolt. It ultimately fails. And Brown petitions Douglass, argues for him to join, and Douglass refuses to join the plot. And I wonder whether I would resist the characterization of that as hypocritical. I tend to think of this as Douglass exercising political judgment about whether he thinks this is going to work. Like I think there's other scholars that can give even more nuanced reasoning of this, but I think there's something plausible to the idea that Douglass would love to enlist in this type of project if he thought it would be successful. But in his own, autobiography after the Civil War, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, he says, I didn't join because I didn't think this was going to be a successful raid. And I guess maybe to tie that back to the large theme that I'm trying to articulate tonight, I don't think that that's hypocritical, especially in the context of Republican citizenship. He's precisely doing the kind of thing that makes you a Republican citizen in that context. He's responding to someone else's effort to engage in a certain kind of resistance, and he's exercising judgment in response to it. It's very different from like if John Brown came and knocked up on his house to try to talk to him, and Douglass kept the door closed and closed his ears and refused to engage with John Brown. Rather, they sit down and they have an extended, heated, intense discussion about what they should do. And that, I think, for Douglass, is the core of political life. It's all of the ways in which we knock up against each other and try to figure out what we should do. I think for Douglass, that's not hypocrisy. That's precisely what it is, to be a citizen.
Oh, outstanding. I mean, I have questions and I could keep you here for all night, but I won't do that to you or to our audience. And I really just want to say thank you. I wish, I said, we were all here so we could give you the round of applause that you deserve, because this was an incredibly thoughtful idea about citizenship and republicanism, and ways of thinking about it as both perhaps a wider, but also perhaps thinner in ways too. So I said, I like your wide, but perhaps that also means not only just narrow, but maybe it's also thinner than we used to think about too. And there are actions of what constitutes, and also therefore the directions too, of what gives it direction, what gives it guides, what gives it bounds, and how that might play out here in these ideas.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for this really lovely conversation. I really enjoyed the chance to talk about this work with you all. Thank you.
I want to thank you again, Phil, Dr. Yaure, for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasure. I hope you guys who've attended tonight will join us again. We'll have our last lecture of the year on Thursday, March 30th at 5:30 p.m. It will be on the campus of Jacksonville State University, but also be online. You can join in through Zoom. Dr. Jonathan Marks will be presenting on free speech on campus. The registration is open at the short link here, which is in the chat, or you can follow us on YouTube or Facebook to see replays or updates. Again, thank you for joining us tonight. There'll be a quick survey afterwards. If you could stick around and fill that in, that we would greatly appreciate that. And we want to thank again the Jack Miller Center and Alabama Humanities Alliance for sponsoring tonight's event. We couldn't do that without their support and their help. And we appreciate you taking time to join us to investigate more about these ideas of American life that continue to animate us today. Even though Douglass isn't here, right? We are still very much engaged in these conversations, and it's incredibly helpful to have these conversations. So thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. And thank you again, Dr. Yaure, for your presentation. It's been a pleasure.
Again.